Diabetes Connections is brought to you by One Touch. Every touch is a step forward. By Dexcom, take control of your diabetes and live life to the fullest with Dexcom. And by No Foods, no grain, no gluten, no guilt.
This is Diabetes Connections with Stacey Sims.
This week, Dana Lewis first created the Do-It-Yourself Pancreas System in December 2013 to just make her own CGM alarms louder. She accomplished much more than that. Now, 5 years later, we look at what she's doing to continue pushing technology forward.
It's just unbelievably, night and day isn't even enough of a difference for those with diabetes to really understand. It's almost the difference between, the before and the after of that initial diagnosis, where it just changes everything for you.
Dana also shares what the FDA and healthcare companies can learn from the do-it-yourself community. A new study this week about emotions and stacking insulin in our Know Better segment. And just what is stacking insulin anyway? This podcast is not intended as medical advice. If you have those kinds of questions, please contact your healthcare provider. Welcome to another week of Diabetes Connections. I'm Stacey Sims. Glad to have you along. I am so excited to talk to Dana Lewis. We talked to her and all about the Do-It-Yourself Pancreas System almost 3 years ago, really when the show was just getting off the ground. And I cannot wait to see what she has to say today. She's one of those people that just pushes the technology forward, and always exciting to talk to her. She's also a great advocate for our community. She speaks in places where people with diabetes don't always go. I'm going to ask her about that. And she's gotten a lot of recognition outside the general diabetes community. But I'm getting ahead of myself. If you are new to the show, I'm glad you found us. We aim to educate and inspire about type 1 diabetes by sharing stories of connection, interviewing influencers and movers and shakers in our community, like Dana, as well as celebrities and athletes and authors and ordinary people just living with diabetes day to day, as well as asking tough questions of healthcare companies and tech providers who are pushing everything along. My son was diagnosed right before he turned 2. He is now 13 and taller than me. My husband has type 2. I don't have diabetes. I have a background in broadcasting. I was a local TV anchor and radio show host for many years here in the Charlotte area, and that's how you get the podcast. If you're a regular listener of the show, I don't spend a lot of time talking about ratings and reviews. If you like the show, share it with somebody you think it might help. But I'm going to take a second and just ask if you are using an Alexa device to listen to the show. And yeah, we are on Amazon Echo. So if you've got Alexa, you can just tell her to, Alexa, play Diabetes Connections podcast. I don't have one right here. I don't know if it fired yours off. Sorry about that. But if you use that, if you could just take a second to rate it, it would be very helpful. Apparently they are using that to help people find it. A lot of people say that about Apple Podcasts, iTunes. It's really not the case over there, although I will welcome a review over there if you'd like as well. But wherever you listen to the podcast is fine with me. I know a lot listen right through Facebook or social media. And if you're doing that right now, just keep in mind I have lots of show notes and links. You can go to diabetes-connections.com and find those there. I do see people listening over Alexa, which is a lot of fun. I can get those stats, and I love it. So if you're doing that, thank you so much. We are available really any place that you can find a podcast. And if you're not sure how to review or anything like that, I'm going to put a self-serving post in the Facebook group this week. So all the links will be there if you want to take a minute and write a review and make it genuine. Whatever you think is more than welcome. Although constructive criticism is always better emailed to me. And mean stuff is always better emailed to me. I'll respond. Hey, don't forget, I was a news anchor for many years. I got a lot of nasty emails. I'll tell you some stories about that someday. Oh, news talk radio is so fun. All right, let's get right to it. Diabetes Connections is brought to you by One Touch. One Touch has been a trusted brand in blood glucose management for more than 30 years. This past year, Pharmacy Times and U.S. News and World Report named One Touch as a #1 pharmacist recommended brand in blood glucose monitoring devices based on a survey of pharmacists nationwide. Find out more about One Touch brand products at diabetes-connections.com and click on the One Touch logo. My guest this week is Dana Lewis, a creator of the Do-It-Yourself Pancreas System, founder of the Open Source Artificial Pancreas System movement, and, in her words, a passionate advocate of patient-centered, driven, and designed research. I spoke to Dana in the fall of 2015, and I'd urge you, go back and listen to that episode. I'll link it up in the show notes. So what is DIYPS? Well, Dana and her now husband, Scott Librand, used existing tools, an older model insulin pump, a small external computer, some other things, to create a system that started as a predictive algorithm that you as the user would then execute. You'd press your own buttons. Then it evolved to a hybrid closed loop where you would bolus for meals to what is now, my understanding, is a no bolus system. Dana and Scott are remarkable in my book, not only for what they've accomplished, but because they have shared this, and that is why it is called Open APS. So lots to catch up on. Dana, welcome back to the show.
Thanks for having me again, Stacey.
It's amazing to me as someone who watches this from afar, and we kind of had a joke when I first talked to you about not knowing what a Raspberry Pi is and realizing it's a type of little computer that you used in all this. So setting the stage that I'm not much better technically than I was at that time. Take us through, if you could, what you're using now. What is your do-it-yourself pancreas system as we speak?
Well, it's funny because technology, both hardware and software, has changed so much over the last couple years. We started with the Raspberry Pi computer, which is a small computer that you can use to talk to the pump and CGM. Over time, people wrote different software to allow us to use better radio sticks, which allowed us to use an even smaller computer called the Intel Edison. So the most common APS rig that you'll see is what we call the Edison Explorer board, which is the size of 2 chapsticks. But because we're using off-the-shelf hardware, we have to use what's available on the market. And sadly, Intel has discontinued the Edison board. So we're super sad, and we're actually moving back to the Raspberry Pi family of hardware. But luckily, that's evolved too. So we'll still have a small pocket-sized rig that we'll be able to use to talk to our pump and CGM.
We'll talk more about the limitations of this kind of thing. As you said, you're limited to what is available. But it is still remarkable to me that you're able to accomplish this. So when you put these things together, what are you getting? Are you using a system where your pump and CGM talk to each other and you're backing off?
Yeah, so this is what's called a hybrid closed loop system, where this computer is reading data from the pump and the CGM in real time, every time there's a new data point. And it does the math over and over again every 5 minutes and issues commands to the pump. Now, because of the speed of currently available insulin, we consider this a hybrid closed loop system because for the best outcomes, people still wanted to announce and bolus for their meals. But through some changes in the algorithms over the year, as well as a slightly faster insulin, some of us have been choosing to not bolus for meals. And I've done that for about 9 months, getting about the same outcomes as I was before, with bolusing for meals. And it's really nice to be able to have that freedom of choice to choose between, do I want to spike to 150 and not bolus? Or do I want to bolus and have a flatter meal curve that maybe spikes at 120? I think before, a lot of us would say, those don't sound like bad choices at all, but it's nice to even have that flexibility to choose. If you don't want to pull your pump out and bolus in front of somebody, it's nice to be able to have the choice and still have pretty decent outcomes, even if you're not going to bolus up front for a meal.
Yeah, as the mom of a now teenage boy, I would say spiking as a quote to 150. That sounds pretty cool. So, but what you're saying is you're using a hands-off system where you're not bolusing, you're kind of going up to maybe 150 and then you're coming back down, but you're not touching it. 9 months?
Well, I'm still doing a meal announcement, which is like, to somebody would say, okay, well, it's still a hybrid closed loop system because you're still doing a meal announcement. But for me, that's entering, say, 60 carbs via single button press on my watch or my phone. It doesn't have to be very precise. And that's the other nice thing is even though I'm doing a quote unquote meal announcement, it's not a lot of work. I can eyeball the meal and say, it's roughly 30, 60, 90 above that. And that gets good enough outcomes without having to have to be that precise. And I think the more burden we can ease on people in terms of having to be less precise and still getting the optimal outcomes that you want. I love that as a person with diabetes.
Yeah, that sounds great. And again, I apologize in advance. This is the first and last time. Apologies for all the stupid questions, technically, because there's going to be a bunch. But when you say announce, you're just telling the pump carbs are coming and then this is how many I think? You're not actually saying put in this amount of, bolus 6 units.
Correct. Just announcing the carbs. And that can be done via the pump through the bolus wizard, say 60 carbs, enter, and you don't do a bolus. Or when your rig is connected to the internet, you can press a button on your watch or on your phone or text using Siri or say, hey, Alexa, I'm eating 60 carbs. And any of those methods will get the carb count to the rig. The rig will take that into account and it will use that to then dose the insulin to the pump.
Wow. Take us back if you could. As I mentioned in the introduction there, I'm hoping people will listen to that first episode that we did. And by that time, you and Scott had already developed the system so that it was pretty much a hybrid closed loop, but with meal bolusing. Can you talk a little bit about the first goal you had was really just to shut up the alarms, right? Or make it better so you could sleep through the night?
Exactly. Yeah.
And with that accomplished, did you think, it's hard to put yourself in those, back where you were at that time, but did you think at that time something like this would come of it?
No, I mean, for the first several months, I was just thrilled to wake up at night. I mean, that sounds so foreign to me because within a year, we evolved to a system that allowed me to sleep through the night. And the goal was, don't wake me up because the computer can do a better job than I can, only wake me up if it's a true emergency. And it's really hard for me to look back and say, wow, it's been 3 years of sleeping through the night and maybe waking up once every 6 months for a low under 55, where I would have to take carbs. It's just unbelievably night and day isn't even enough of a difference for those with diabetes to really understand. It's almost the difference between, the before and the after of that initial diagnosis where it just changes everything for you. So having a closed loop technology just for overnight alone is a huge life changer. And just, it totally improved my quality of life of actually being able to sleep at night and sleep well and not feeling crummy when I woke up every morning.
It seems like such a small thing. But
it's huge.
It's huge. It is your life. I mean, it's incredible. And then you shared this. I don't have the exact numbers, but when we last spoke, there were not a lot of people. I want to say maybe 30. And now there are more than 600 people. Do you have numbers on how many are using this?
Yeah, we estimate over 600 people using some shape or form of a DIY closed loop system. There's now a couple of them out there. And this is a very conservative number based on just people who've told me, humans that have told me that they're looping. So it may be closer to 1,000 at this point in time. And if you think about a general estimate of people who are just using it overnight or during the day, if you add up all the hours that people have used this technology, it's closing in on 4 million hours, which is significant because a lot of the pivotal trials for the commercial systems have something like 150,000 hours. And this community has millions of hours of experience. So it's astonishing and amazing to me that so many people have not only chose to try this technology, but have continued to use it because they found it to be beneficial. And to me, it's not surprising because I keep using it because it helps me so much. But I'm just thrilled that so many other people have found that, yeah, it's worth, some of the downsides of the technical challenges of keeping the system going because of those daytime and nighttime benefits.
Yeah. Is the biggest challenge finding a pump that can do this? And when you answer that, could you explain what you need? Right back to Dana in just a moment. But Diabetes Connections is brought to you by Dexcom. And, we are so lucky. We have a great relationship with Dr. V. That's our endocrinologist. I could even email him and get help and answers. But using the Dexcom makes all of that even easier. We used to keep logs a long time ago. But with the Dexcom G5 mobile CGM system, you get a reading every 5 minutes. It makes it easy to spot trends and get a dynamic picture of your blood glucose levels. I used to keep everything on a yellow legal pad when Benny was first diagnosed. But being able to send our information through Dexcom Clarity to our endo makes appointments a lot more productive. Look, managing diabetes is not easy, but I feel like we have one of the best CGM systems working for us. For more information, go to diabetes-connections.com and click on the Dexcom logo. Now back to my interview with Dana Lewis.
Yeah, so right now in the United States, we are using existing technically approved pumps that were approved at one time, but there's a big cybersecurity scare, and this version of firmware was basically recalled. And so all future pumps do not have a firmware that allows you to loop, the ability to remotely send a command to run a temp basal on it. So the biggest challenge in the US has been finding these older version pumps that many people probably listening to this podcast. If you have an older Medtronic pump sitting in your drawer, you should check it out because it might have the firmware that allows somebody to loop with it. And you might want to use it yourself or pass it on to somebody in the community. But luckily, there have been some other pumps that have come to non-US markets that actually have Bluetooth capability and the ability to do some of these dosing commands. So for example, the confusingly named Dana R pump that's made by a Korean company called Suil has Bluetooth to allow it to connect directly with an Android phone. So for many people in Europe and Asia, they're able to use this phone, connect it, or use that pump, connect it to a phone, and actually have the algorithm be hosted on the phone to talk directly to the pump, removing the need to have the Raspberry Pi computer to interface between the phone and the pump. And because that pump is in warranty, currently being sold, available on some of those other markets, that has tremendously removed some of the burden of finding a loopable pump, because that's something that many health systems are supporting. Now, there's been a couple of other pumps that we've been investigating in the community. One of them is the Roche Combo pump, which was being sold until recently in the US and is available elsewhere in the world. It too has Bluetooth, and it too is something that the community has figured out how to use. So there's a growing body of pumps that are available somewhere in the world. But one of the things we've been advocating for and working with the companies is saying, we shouldn't have to reverse engineer the Bluetooth protocol and to communicate with the pump. This is something that the companies should be opening their protocols for. And if you've heard about the JDRF's opening protocol initiative, that's exactly what they're trying to encourage, saying patients shouldn't have to reverse engineer or hack to be able to communicate with their individual pump. Companies should be documenting their protocols and making it secure so that more of these pumps could be loopable. And then people could choose. Do they want a commercial algorithm when it's available? Is a DIY algorithm better for them? But really to be able to choose the best pump, the best CGM, and the best algorithm for them.
And you've been very outspoken and doing a lot of work on that side of it. I want to talk more about that, but let me go back for just a quick second to the pump. As you said, unfortunately or confusingly named Dana. So that's not your pump?
It has nothing to do with me. They've actually been making quote unquote Dana pumps longer than I've been alive. So I've not had luck getting them to convince the name, but I always like to bring it up. And I tell people when they mention the pump online, put Dana *R so people know that they're talking about the Suil branded pump and not something related to me, Dana Lewis, because it does get really confusing.
So many of us saw that because I have heard of the pump and I thought, oh, wow, look at her go. I figured that it was either an homage or you worked with them. I've since found out, obviously, that's not the case, so I'm glad you brought it up. But I know that must be funny for you, too.
It's funny, but I have to give that company a lot of credit. Although, again, I have nothing to do with it. They have actually reached out and worked with several of the developers in the Android APS community to make sure that their future pump products are still going to be loopable with Android APS. And they actually talk very openly about Android APS and Open APS, which is fascinating because those of us sitting in the US look at that and go, the FDA would never let that happen. Yeah. But the regulatory environment in Asia may be a little bit different. And so they feel very comfortable talking about it and encouraging it, which is, a very fascinating dynamic and a good lesson to us about, how different things are around the world for those of us with diabetes, because we all have different access to, insurance coverage, pumps, CGMs, technology. And so even when one thing is available or approved in one place, like people talk a lot about, well, in the US, there's one commercial system approved. Like, why don't you stop what you're doing with DIY? And my answer is, well, that one system may not work for everybody, but also it's not available worldwide, and that's something we have to keep in mind is we have to keep pushing for access for this technology and access to insulin because diabetes is not solved by any stretch of the imagination.
Oh, yeah. All right. So let's talk about the JDRF effort, as you mentioned. Do you think that's going to make a difference? I mean, I was really glad to see that, but I'm also really concerned where I sit about, the pump makers opening it up, the FDA approving that kind of thing. I'm not cynical about it, but I am wary. You have a lot more inside information. What's your reaction to that effort?
My initial reaction was I'm optimistic but cynical about the speed at which it will happen. I wasn't in doubt that it would make a difference. My question was just how quickly can the JDRF itself move quickly, and how quickly can they have the companies move in this direction? Because I think everybody's saying the same thing. JDRF, the companies, the FDA have said interoperability and the ability to separately approve and bring to market a pump, a CGM, and an algorithm is the future. But I think we've needed that additional force, which is this initiative to get the companies to expedite their efforts around that, versus trying to bring a full stack product of pump and CGM and algorithm, to the market. And so I do think that the initiative, I've seen evidence of that speeding the companies up, of them thinking differently as a result of that public pressure of the initiative. So again, I still think it could always move faster. And I'm ready to see a pump come to market with that open protocol or an existing pump be updated. But I do think it is helping, which gives me hope.
I know you're a big part of the We Are Not Waiting community, but just to translate, I should really jump in. If this is the first time you're hearing, we're kind of shorthanding a lot of this. I will put more information in the show notes. But to be crystal clear, when you're talking about Bluetooth-enabled and older pumps that don't have these protocols, it's almost a remote on a bit of, I don't want to say on steroids, but to me, that's a good way to describe it. You need a pump that will be able to take instructions remotely. Is that a good way to describe it?
Exactly.
Okay.
Yes.
So, the Animus pump with the remote, it couldn't work though, right? Because the Bluetooth wasn't set up so that you could open it up?
Well, the Animus Pink pump had the remote ability to bolus, but not to use temporary basal rates.
Oh,
so there's one
right.
or two people in the community who've used that, but they have to have a bolus-only system, and they don't have the safety elements of fall back to standard basal the way we've designed that around Open APS. That's a big part of our safety design. Is, if your rig breaks, you go out of range, the power goes out, something, you fall back to standard pump operation. It's very safe. You've got your underlying basal rates. But for the ping pump, technically, yes, it can be used. But in my opinion, that's not a good option for most people who are willing to DIY because you don't have that safety profile of falling back to basals. So that's what we need, is not only the ability to remotely communicate, but also the commands to be able to set the basal rates, because that's really crucial.
Got it. All right. So while we're talking specific pumps, I know that there is a huge effort of people who use the Omnipod to try to open that up. Are you involved in that at all, or you're keeping track of that?
Yeah, I'm a part of that community. I'm not actively working on the Omnipod, but I do a lot of answering questions and trying to connect developers back into that community, because the more people we have helping on that effort, the faster it's going to get done. And the group of developers working in that are doing a phenomenal job and just plugging away. It's not close. So one of the number one questions I get is, when is it coming? And something important to know is that if it's not done yet, because everybody's doing this as volunteers and their spare time, there's no company behind it, there's no ship date that anybody's going to promise you. So I would say, if you're interested in looping and you want to get started, start now with one of the other pumps. And then if and when Omnipod is finally ready for looping, you can switch over to that. Because I think a lot of people assume that, if you start looping, or whether with a DIY or commercial system, you're locked into that forever. That's not the case. You will have choices now and in the future. You can switch between different DIY systems, whether it's the pump, whether it's the algorithm, whether it's the hardware. And I think that's really important. And I would say, don't wait, because it's just absolutely life-changing. And I would rather, see people go for 3 months on one system and then switch to another, versus go those 3 months with the highs and the lows and the overnight interruption, rather than waiting to loop if it's something that they think they're going to want to do.
Every time I talk to one of you We Are Not Waiting people, I want to do it. But I'll be honest with you, I feel like this is so far out of my area of expertise that I would actually worry more. I mean, my kid's 13. He's interested in computers and that kind of thing. And I'm thinking as he gets older, I'm hoping that the commercial systems will be out. But if he wants to do this, I would be okay with it. It's the fear I have of doing it for him that, that really worries me. I'm not asking you to convince me, but if someone is in my shoes, let's say a parent who's listening right now saying, I don't even know how to hook up I'm going to date myself. I was going to say hook up my cable. I don't even know how to update my phone. What would be the first step?
So the first step is listening to a podcast like this. And then the next step would be going to somewhere like openaps.org and reading or listening to some of the other videos and stories of people who've been looping. From my perspective, technological capability is not the blocker. The blocker is willingness to do it and the willingness to learn. The analogy I like to use, it's like switching between PC to Mac or Android to iPhone. You've chosen to do it. You have the willingness, I'm going to buy this new hardware, I'm going to use it, I'm going to switch, but there's a learning curve. And with diabetes, it's the same way. When you're switching from a manual system to an automated system, whether it's DIY or commercial, you're going to have to learn to do things differently. You're going to have opportunities to learn how to build it, how to monitor it, how to set it up to the degree where you feel safe. And that might change over time, and you can evolve how you have it set up and allow it to do more or less based on your preferences. But it really comes down to that willingness. If you don't want to do it, that's totally fine. I respect people who don't want to DIY loop. That's totally fine. But I wouldn't let perceived technical capabilities be the barrier. Because I've seen now, out of the hundreds of people in the community, I would say more than 2/3 of us don't have an engineering background or a technical background. And so you're able to go in and read the read the documentation, which is pretty clear. It's like building a Lego kit, but with a supportive community. So if you run into a step where you're like, I don't know how to connect the yellow brick to the green brick, you ask a question in one of the online channels in Facebook or in Gitter, and there's dozens of people worldwide who can help answer the question and walk you through and help you understand what you're doing. And so, yes, again, learning process, different technology, different way of dealing with diabetes, but it's rooted around the same principles you have for treating diabetes of you've got an algorithm that's going to micro adjust every 5 minutes. You've got something that's reading between the pump and the CGM, but instead of it being your brain, you're training the computer to do the math that you're doing. So it's going to read your settings and make the decisions based on the inputs you give it. And if you want to change the output, you change the input of adjusting your settings, or telling it something different. And so it's very relatable to how people treat diabetes already. It's meant to be a very intuitive system. All the DIY systems are. So I would say if you're even remotely interested, don't let the fear of the technology overwhelm you. I would say go ahead and start reading, because the other thing too is even if you decide not to DIY loop, the reality is a lot of these lessons about how to automate diabetes management will apply to you using a commercial system. And so that little bit that you learn in the process of evaluating DIY will help you in the future if you choose a commercial system too.
Huh. All right. I'll go read some more. I promise. I think the hardest part for me will actually be finding a pump, finding a loopable pump. I really do feel like you'll laugh. I haven't done it yet because I feel like until I'm committed to doing this or until my son really wants to do it, because at 13, I think this is a decision he needs to make. I can't just tell him to do it. I almost feel like if I find a loopable pump, I'm taking it away from someone who is really going to do it. So I'll keep you posted. And
the other thing I'll say too is, again, don't assume you'll be locked into that decision together forever. And also you can try it and decide it's not for you and sell your equipment. But also if you just want to do it at night because you're like, hey, I just want that sleep thing she's talking about. You can have it just sit at the bedside, and when you go to school or when you go to work, you're out of range of it. You just fall back to manual mode. No problem. When you come back into range, you get in bed at night, it starts reading, it starts looping. So, you can really make it work for you, whether you want to just start with an hour a day of using it, just overnight, just on weekends when you can watch it. A lot of people do that. It's not jump in, to the deep end without trying. You can wade into the baby pool, you can go down the steps, you can kind of go at your own rate and make it work for you. Like that's the whole point of this is make it work for you, make it flexible enough to work with real world diabetes.
I'll let you know when I get my floaties on.
Deal.
In addition to creating this with Scott and putting the instructions on and being so open about it, you have been very front and center in speaking at conventions, other groups outside of the diabetes community, or what we'd consider like the traditional diabetes online community, and even meeting with regulators and tech companies. Can you share a little bit about, things that you've learned and really continuing to push this forward?
Well, I think it comes back to what we were talking about with the JDRF Opening Protocols Initiative. And I also have to say, I'm certainly not the only one who has helped with these systems or is helping the community or is doing this. There's dozens of people in this community, which is, why it's been evolving at such an incredible rate. So I just really want to highlight that there's this amazing community of developers and supporters who are helping each other in the community and also having these conversations. And I think that's what's really made the difference is we've had so many people from the community step up and be able to go and talk with the FDA when they're at the conferences or be able to talk with the diabetes companies, when they run into them and say, look, here's what the community needs. We need you to move faster. We need these kind of features. We need the ability to see our data in real time. We need remote monitoring. Because a lot of these things are absolutely crucial. Because if you think about the timeline it takes traditionally to develop a medical device, it's years. And so a lot of the input we've been given the company for the last 2 or 3 years from this community, that's really going to shape the second generation of these closed loop systems when they come to the commercial market. So it may get to some of the first generations ones, but realistically, this is about helping shape and improve the second generation of systems. And that's what gives me a lot of hope is seeing that, we are seeing the companies being open and amenable to learning, from those million hours of this community experience. And we are seeing the regulators be super aware of the community and the regulators saying like, hey, when the companies bring something, we will review it in record time. And they've done that with several diabetes products. So I think it's very, very encouraging, but I think it involves all of us continuing to speak up and accept that, just because we're patients doesn't mean that we can't influence things. I think that's something that when I think back to my first 10 years of living with diabetes compared to the last 4 or 5, just the difference between feeling like I was a passive recipient of technology and I couldn't change it, to now realizing not only can I design my own tools for myself and share them with other people, but we can definitely influence these products, the system design, how these companies work and provide data to patients. So I think we all have a really important role to continue to play in terms of speaking up and saying, like, here's what we need to make these systems and products work for real world diabetes, not just in clinical trials, because we can't just have these one size fits all products that don't really work for real life. People won't use them. Insurance companies won't cover them if people aren't using them. So I think it's up to all of us to continue to have those conversations. But I'm excited because the companies, the FDA, academia, industry, everybody's listening, everybody's aware. And so I think we have this huge opportunity specific to diabetes of really being able to drive that. But I also think we can share with some of our friends and other patient communities of, here's those hard lessons learned. Here's how we were able to pick up steam as a community, and share whether it's open source projects or how to work with companies in a collaborative way to actually move the needle on things. Because a lot of what we've done in diabetes, I would love to see replicated to a lot of other healthcare communities as well.
Yeah. You mentioned that you're not the only person, and we have talked to many people involved in the We Are Not Waiting community, people that I've referred to as hackers, even though I think, like you, I hate that word. So, as you listen, if you'd like to go back to diabetes-connections.com, there's a search box on the upper right, and you could explore these issues with the hashtag, We Are Not Waiting, or with, looping or APS, lots of the words, the keywords that we've talked about, and see that. Dana, I don't know if you can answer this, but I'm curious, you talked about these companies. Is there any company in particular, I'll ask the good question, not the bad question, that you feel like they get it? And you can name names. I mean, responsive, I don't care. You can name whatever names you want in terms of companies that you really feel like, yes, those people understand it. They're moving forward.
So I have two companies that come to mind for different examples of different reasons. And I have to say, I don't have any financial links to any of these companies. And this is my own personal opinion. One company I've been particularly impressed by is Dexcom, because they developed an API that allows individuals to get real-time access to their data. And in specific iterations of their products, they could have closed that down. It's not a feature that they promote, but it's what allows a lot of us to take our Dexcom data and share it in Nightscout, a open source remote monitoring site that has a lot of other benefits. They could have easily closed the back door on that, turned that off, and they have very intentionally made sure not to do that. And I think that is a great example of where a company is, love them or hate them, for many reasons, that is one of the good things that they are doing that I would love to see companies do more of, which is have the infrastructure, have the APIs, have the protocols in place to allow individuals to do what they want with their data in a meaningful way, because it doesn't harm their bottom line. It actually hurts them. So I think that is one example that I've been continuously pleased by. The other company that I want to highlight, again, no financial relationship at all, is called DIYPS. They are a company working on a closed-loop artificial pancreas system. Most people haven't heard about them because they're based in France, and they've not been they're present. They're at all the scientific conferences, but from my experience, most patients, most of my friends with diabetes don't know who they are. But what's interesting about them is they have specifically evaluated the code from the open source looping communities. They've ported it into their systems. They've run it side by side. They've run tests, and they've evaluated how their code and their algorithm does compared to ours. And in some cases, they pulled in some of our safety features because they've realized we've designed in a way that catches some edge cases in a smart way. And so they've actually incorporated some of our features into their system. Now, I think they're doing pivotal trials right now. I haven't actually seen their algorithm. I don't know what their product looks like in terms of usability, what the data is going to be, but I at least think that kind of process, what they're doing in terms of process, in terms of leaning on the open source community, is what all companies should be doing. So I'm hoping more companies will hear this and realize, hey, this MIT license of this open source code means that any company can use it, and they should use it, and that they'll probably be at a disadvantage not to be using it to at least meet the standard being set by the open source community in terms of what this technology can do.
That reminds me, I sent DIYPS an email in December, and I haven't heard back from them. And it's funny because Tomas Walker from Dexcom is the one who told me about them. So I will definitely have to follow up. So I'm really, that's interesting that you mentioned them. And, you talked about other communities. Let's talk quickly, if we could, about Open Humans. This is one of the things, I Google my guests, generally speaking, right before I talk to them, just in case I missed anything. And this openhumans.org thing popped up, sharing data for the greater good. And you're mentioned in this. So this is beyond diabetes. What is this?
So Open Humans is a platform that was designed around making it easy for people to share their data and easy for people to donate data to research projects. And so I love this because this platform has enabled me to create a place for people to anonymously upload either Nightscout data if they have CGM data in Nightscout, and also for people using DIY closed loop systems to donate their closed loop data to an Open APS data commons. And the reason I love this is it's an easy way to donate data to research. It allows people to donate their data once and not to be, having to upload their data every time a researcher comes by and says, hey, I need CGM data. Hey, I need closed loop data. And we've been able to get the word out to a lot of researchers who are able to get this data, in big chunks and use it for a variety of research projects. So I just love the way the platform exists. It makes it very easy to work with and design tools with. And it's easy for both me as a person and us as persons to donate our data very easily, but also to facilitate research. Because one of my observations has been over the last year, as I've been very public about having diabetes, is I would get emails about once a week from a random researcher saying, hey, would you share your diabetes data with me? I need to, I would need to do a study. I need to assess if this is feasible with diabetes data. But I didn't feel comfortable with my data being, identified, and also because I don't represent the full diabetes community. I am not an average person. And so I wanted a way to be able to share data with these researchers because I was also observing a lot of non-traditional and new researchers who are like, hey, I think I can apply this cool innovation to diabetes, but diabetes data and doing diabetes clinical trials are really expensive. So to me, this is a bird that kills many stones of making it easier for patients, making it easy for researchers, having more people who are able to do diabetes related research and build, whether it's tools, apps, algorithms. So I'm really excited to see how tools like this that are, multi-purposes, they're not designed just for diabetes, are really going to help facilitate more diabetes research and innovation.
Wow. Yeah, usually I start at the beginning of the interview, I talk about when you were diagnosed. We skipped over all of that, but I'll bring it up now as I want to ask you a question. You were diagnosed, you were a freshman in high school?
That's right. I was 14.
Okay. When you were diagnosed, obviously the kind of stuff you're doing now was not something that you thought of because you didn't even know what was going to happen. But do you remember the before and the after? You mentioned that was like the before and after for the sleep, the before and after for diabetes.
I remember it vividly. I was 3 months into high school. I was old enough to understand everything that was going on. I can remember the months of symptoms leading up to my diagnosis, my feeling during the moment, just the impact on my life afterwards, both of that feeling of physical relief when the first insulin shot started taking effect into my body, as well as just the constant struggle with the highs and the lows and being an active teenager, and also the interrupted sleep and how it made me feel with all this physical and emotional baggage of dealing with it.
I don't know if you can remember back this far. I'm not trying to make this too dramatic, but I'm thinking about the way you sleep now. And you hadn't had that kind of sleep since before you were diagnosed. I mean, did you think about that the first couple of times you didn't wake up because you had good blood sugars overnight?
Well, just for clarity, I am a really good sleeper. So I would sleep really, really long and deep, but either wake up, like in the 40s or wake up because I was 300. So I would sleep really good, except for when I was really low or high. So when I did start having good blood sugars overnight, I woke up and it was like those first couple of mornings where I slept really well and my blood sugar was perfect overnight. It did feel like that first insulin shot of like that. There was just a huge physical difference in terms of starting the day in a positive way versus just feeling like you'd been dragged down the road. I mean, it's just a complete difference in feeling of just overnight. And that's why I think even if people just use this kind of technology overnight, it makes such a big difference of starting the day of feeling so much better.
Isn't it funny too, how with diabetes, like you said, you slept soundly even though you were low or high. And other people wake up if they go under a certain number or over a certain number, they just wake up because they feel crummy. It's so different for everybody.
Yeah, the thing I say over and over again online, you'll see me say, YDMV, your diabetes may vary. And I mean, the other thing that fascinates me too is just how people change over the time. This is something I think people who design systems and products in healthcare don't understand, like what I wanted and what I needed when I was 14 versus 21 versus 29, and even well in between there, like even days of the week, my preferences and needs are very, very different. And it's always frustrated me that people assume, like, okay, person with diabetes, here's the persona, here's the one size fits all, what they need and what they want, and we're going to design a bare bones system for that. That's always really frustrated me because I do think, why DMV, but also why DMV day to day. Everybody's going to be different based on their lifestyle needs, and I would love to be flexible down down to the hour of what people's days look like.
That's a great point. It really is. Because I think in my head, and maybe other parents feel this way, I think in my head, I feel like, well, once he gets to be 18, it's done. And then I'm always reminded, no. Because the growth is, Benny, he was not yet 2. He weighed 27 pounds. Now his foot probably weighs 27 pounds. He's a size 12 foot now, and he's 13. He's bigger than me. So it's, I in my back of my head, I'm like, oh yeah, well, when the hormones and the growth are done. But yeah, thanks for that reminder.
The other thing I'll say related to being diagnosed at 14 and this idea of it gets better at some point, one of the things I remember vividly is 13, 14, 15, I struggled a lot. And I remember one of my endocrinologists saying to me, it'll be better when you're about the time you're 25. And I was like, well, that's not helpful at all. Shouldn't it be around 18 when I stopped growing? But it really was around my mid-20s when things just got gradually better. Now, granted, that was about the time we started with all this technology too. So my experience was a little bit colored by that. But just in terms of having a more regular schedule, my body kind of being done growing and taking out at least a little bit of the hormones and the noise that went on with growing up with diabetes. So at some point, it may not be 18, but things will get a little bit easier both for him and for you as a parent.
Thank you. Something else I read about you that I hadn't realized is there's a different kind of technology, and this isn't quite about diabetes, but I think we'll relate it there when we're done. And that is this wearable stomach monitor that I read about. And, there's so many gastric issues that go along with diabetes, or in people in families with autoimmune issues. So you're involved in this. This is in clinical trials. It's some kind of stomach sensor. Can you talk a little bit about this?
Yeah, I got introduced to this professor at UCSD, and his lab is working on this wearable GI sensor. It's a small 3D printed box, and right now it's 10 electrodes that you stick on your stomach. So it's like a couple more pump sites, on your abdomen. And what it does is it tracks the stomach activity. So as you eat food and your body digests it, it basically tracks the noise of how you're digesting. And so you can get a read on when you have activity. And the reason I asked them to use it, I'm not doing it as part of a clinical trial. I was just like, I immediately had this idea of, wow, we could learn a lot as it relates to type 1 diabetes, because I knew there was a high prevalence. I think that's about 40 to 50% of people with type 1 are estimated to have gastroparesis, which means that they have slowed digestion and gastric emptying. And obviously that has implications on insulin dosing. And so kind of the light bulb went off, and I was like, if I could wear this and tie it with some of my Open APS data, that might give us some ideas about typical T1 digestion, potential impacts on blood sugar, and maybe we could design some studies for people with type 1 and gastroparesis, as well as people with type 1 without gastroparesis, to see, could this sensor be used to improve diagnosis of those issues, or help people learn how to better, dose their insulin if they have some of those issues, or even just understand it's well known that activity slows digestion down. So if you took a walk after dinner, that's going to slow your digestion down, but also it expedites the insulin. And so that's why a lot of people will go low if they walk home from dinner or walk after dinner. And so just better understanding all these little things that add up to really impact your blood sugar management. And so I've been wearing it. I've worn it probably almost a dozen times, sometimes for a couple hours, sometimes for 24 hours. And it's just been really fascinating to see it. And right now, again, I said it's 10 electrodes, which is kind of a lot of stuff on your stomach. But they're working on a smaller system that eventually I think is going to be closer to the size of, what a CGM transmitter and sensor on your body would be, maybe 2 or 3 electrodes, which I think would be a lot more usable for a wearable you might wear once or once a month or something like that.
And it's not, it doesn't have a cannula, right? You're not inserting all of these things with a needle, right? This is just kind of like the sticky that they put on to monitor your heart in the hospital.
It's a sticky electrode, exactly.
Okay, because it looks like a plastic disc, so like an octopus, surrounded by all these little electrodes. So I'll link that up so people can look at it. But I think that's really interesting as someone with my own digestive issues, to find out what's going on. And I love this great line. One of the researchers said, this is the Rodney Dangerfield of GI motility. It gets no respect. But maybe it will. And I appreciate you talking about that, because it's fascinating to see, what else people are doing when it comes to measuring our, our health and our signals.
Yeah, and I think that kind of just points back to the thing I was talking about earlier about having other researchers be interested in diabetes, because when I first talked to these GI folks, they were like, oh yeah, we had this one person, we know you have diabetes, there's this one person with diabetes, and they gave us all this data. I was like, oh, okay, cool. Like what data did you get? I was thinking about, comparing it to some of my Open APS data, where every 5 minutes we've got the blood sugar, what the blood sugar was predicted to do, what it actually did, the calculated difference, the calculated sensitivity. I mean, there's like 24 things that we're calculating every 5 minutes that would be fascinating to graph with the stomach data. They're like, oh, well, we have, their insulin dosing and their CGM graph. And I'm like, oh, well, like if you let me try this, like here's all this other data that I could show you, and we could see it in concert and see if we could apply it to type 1. And their eyes lit up and they're like, oh yeah, that would be really cool. So they're fascinated by it and they're very interested in it. But I just think there's a lot of people out there developing these amazing sensors and amazing technology that until they have the conversation with somebody with type 1, a researcher, a person with diabetes, they may not realize that their technology could potentially benefit people with type 1. And so I think the more we have these conversations, the more we share ideas across these healthcare communities, the more opportunities we'll find like this. And, who knows, maybe this won't be helpful for real-time dosing, but it doesn't hurt to explore it. And I would rather go down the path of exploring it and figuring it out and making sure we can't use it, rather than just saying, well, of course we can't use it, because assumptions, it means you don't get anything done.
Yeah, that's a great point. When we last spoke, Dana, you and Scott were newlyweds. And if I recall, I'm trying to think, did he hold your rig during the wedding? Was that when it was still separate and all this stuff, right? We told him he was like you guys were the first people to get married.
Right. He wore it. That was when we still had a Raspberry Pi rig, because we got married August 1st, 2015. And he wore it in a flip belt around his waist under his tux.
Romance. So how's married life? How's everybody doing? Let me get personal. I mean, you're traveling. I see him on Twitter and you're somewhere else. And you always report, and this is, I guess, a different question. You always report going through airports and how it goes. But how's everything going with you guys?
Oh, everything's wonderful. It's really funny. So I do tweet every time I go through airport security, just because people ask like, oh my gosh, what do you do with your rig when you travel? And the answer is put it through X-ray. It's totally fine. But also because of social media, because of digital technology, even though I travel a lot and I miss him, we can stay connected. He can also see what's happening with my rigs and everything. And we often develop together. Like he's at home, I'm on a plane. Sometimes he'll be on a plane for work and I'm on a plane at the same time, and we have virtual coding dates from the air. So we're as geeky as we sound. We do that. But it's really nice because I love that he, not only fell in love with me, of course, but he is such, so passionate too about making not only my life better, but everybody else with diabetes. I think it's one thing for those of us with diabetes to do it, but I am just in awe of people like you, Stacey, a lot of the parents in the looping community. So Pete Schwam, Katie DeSimone, just countless parents who just dedicate so much amazing time. And then spouses too, like Scott. It's just incredible. And it blows me away as a person with diabetes. And it just, every time I see people like this engaging in the community, it's just such a pure, selfless act of love that they do over and over again, because it's a choice to spend time. It's a choice to do all of this work. And so as a person with diabetes and as a spouse, speaking of Scott, it's so cool, because it's like I just see these amazing examples of love. It's not just the dramatic things of he wore my pancreas at the wedding, but it's like, he helped build my pancreas. It's just so amazing.
Yeah. It's funny. I was talking to my father recently, Benny's grandfather, and something came up, and it was something small like, well, someone we didn't know provided a basketball ticket to a kid with type 1. It was something like that. And my father said, this community is amazing. He said, people just drop everything to help people with diabetes. Once you're in this community, he said, it just is incredible. And everybody has a role they can play, whether it's wearing the pancreas at the wedding. I mean, the amazing work the two of you have done, the other people that you mentioned who are helping with looping. I mean, somebody like me talking into a microphone, but everybody's got a role. Even if it's just, I walked and raised $20, or I babysat some kid, or I gave him a hug. A new mom, I welcome to the community, and everybody does it. There's not many people I've met in this community who have said, yeah, I'm going to keep to myself. It's a really incredible that way. So I appreciate all the, everything you said, and I agree with it, but there's just something about it. And sometimes an outsider, although my dad's cute. I wouldn't call him an outsider, but he did tell me when Benny was diagnosed as a toddler, he's like, I'll do anything you want, but I'm not giving him a shot. So, Yeah,
I think that element of that specialness of how people give back and pay it forward is why the Open APS community has grown the way it has, why there are so many looping options. one of the things I also perceive as a barrier in open source is people are like, I can't do open source. And I point out, I'm like, you just answered a question for somebody. That is open source. Yeah. You just edited the documentation. That is open source. Like there's dozens of ways that people help each other. And many of them are the core components of open source. It's not just the coding. That is a part of it. There's so many of these other roles and things that people do that are a critical part of it. And I continue to be blown away by it, because without all these people helping, we wouldn't be reaching hundreds of people with this type of technology. It just would not have happened. Yeah. So that spirit is just amazing. And I always tell people, I'm sorry that they've been diagnosed with diabetes, but, welcome to one of the most amazing communities you'll ever meet.
No doubt. Before I let you go, Dana, what's next? Are you and Scott working on more things for the do-it-yourself pancreas system? Are you tweaking?
Yeah, we've continued to tweak the hardware like we talked about. The next rig will be with a Raspberry Pi. It also has a screen on it, so you don't have to have a phone to see what's happening on the rig. It's got buttons. You can add unicorns to it or your favorite animal of choice, whatever you want to do with it. We continue to work on the algorithms. Like I said, the no bolus thing wasn't something we set out to do. It's been very cool to be able to experiment, but that's in part because we've continued to iterate on the algorithm. And then the other thing that I'm working on is more of the space on how do we translate what we've learned in diabetes to these other health communities. Yeah. These open source principles of building the technology, of building a community to help contribute to documentation and support and everything else. I think that there's a lot of special things that happen in diabetes community that in some ways is because of the amazing people in the community like we talked about. But at the same time, I think we can help light that same kind of we are not waiting spark in other communities. And that's what I'm excited to do so that more healthcare patient communities can experience the same kind of innovations we get in diabetes.
That would be wonderful. Dana, thank you so much for joining me. I don't want to embarrass you, but I have talked about you for years as one of the pioneers in this community. I do think when the book is written years from now, you are just one of those people that will be in the history books. And I appreciate everything that you're doing. So thanks for coming on and giving us an update. And I hope we can talk again soon.
Yeah, thanks so much, Stacey.
You're listening to Diabetes Connections with Stacey Sims.
Lots more information about Dana, about Open APS. She mentioned a lot of blogs and videos and guidelines, which I suppose I should really check out more now. But all that information at diabetes-connections.com and in the show notes. And I will also link up more information about the Nightscout folks that she mentioned and We Are Not Waiting. I realize that if you're not familiar with that community, maybe this is the first time you've even heard about Open APS or We Are Not Waiting. Lots of background information for you to check out and listen to, because we've done a lot of podcasts, as I mentioned, with other people involved in that community. It all boils down to people like Dana who don't work for a healthcare tech company, don't work for diabetes companies, who took matters into their own hands. And, we are not waiting. That's the motto. Wanted to push the technology ahead, and figured out the means to do it using existing technology and creating the algorithms, creating the coding, if I'm saying that correctly, to make all this stuff work. So all that information online at diabetes-connections.com. In our Know Better segment this week, the Joslin Diabetes Center put out a fascinating article called Are You Bolusing with Your Emotions? All about insulin stacking. Know Better is brought to you by Know Better Foods. They make amazing things like wraps and pasta and waffles and chocolate chips now, and they are all grain, gluten, wheat, soy, dairy, peanut, yeast, and they like to say guilt-free. That's because they're made with superfoods, things like chia, flax, coconut, almonds, and egg whites, and they taste really good. They have cupcakes, and if you're missing that crunch, if you're eating gluten-free, they have croutons, and they have cereal. It is such a great idea, and nobody does it better than Know Foods. You can always save. Just use the promo code STACEY10, STACEY, the number 10, at Know Foods when you order. And you can find out more. Go to diabetes-connections.com and click on the Know Foods logo. Let's talk about insulin stacking. I mentioned this article from the Joslin Diabetes Center about emotional bolusing, which is absolutely fascinating stuff. And this, as they break it down, they say emotional bolusing means you know what the outcome is going to be. You know you're going to be low, but you can't stop yourself. You cannot stand to see the high number stay there. So that's the premise of this article. But what is stacking anyway? And I want to take a moment to explain this because it was one of the things early on we were incredibly confused about. And it's one of the concepts I see a lot of parents, of young children especially, get confused about. In fact, my doctor told me, Benny's doctor told me early on, that this is one of the big questions that he feels that they don't explain well enough. So I will do my very best layperson job of explaining stacking. And I'm going to link up this article which explains it as well in the show notes. Basically, stacking means taking a dose on top of another, and sometimes on top of another. And the reason this is not a great idea is because rapid-acting insulin, the kind that most people use in pumping and for multiple daily injections, we're talking Humalog, Novolog, Apidra, that sort of thing. Most of those insulins peak 40 minutes to 2 hours after you take it. So that's when it is at its highest strength. But it can last anywhere from 3 to 5.5 hours, depending on the individual. This is all individual. You got to talk to your endo because it's different for everybody. But when you start thinking about it in that way, stacking, the term, makes a lot more sense. Let's say you are at 220, you take a correction dose, an hour later, you're at 210. You take another correction dose. Half an hour later, you're at 180 and you want to knock that sucker down. So you take another correction dose. Well, unfortunately, what's happened here is you've now given yourself 3 doses of fast-acting insulin before that first dose is even really finished working. And of course, a little while later, you're going to see a big crash. Now, the confusing part is that stacking doesn't mean you can't eat and dose during that time. So let's say you're 220, once again, you take your correction dose, and then half an hour later you're hungry. Well, when Benny was first diagnosed, I would have said you can't eat because I thought we needed to wait 3 hours in between any insulin dose. So I spent a couple of days not letting my 2-year-old eat except for every 3 hours. If you know any 2-year-olds, that's no fun. Most of them are big-time snackers. And Benny has always been a big-time snacker. And even with that 15-carb free snack that they tell you about, that did not do it for him, although we really, really tried. And I called my endo in frustration. I said, we cannot live like this. What do I do? And he said, oh, no, you can give a dose of insulin for carbs. So in other words, you can bolus if you're eating, you can bolus for the food, right? Give yourself the dose that you would eat for whatever carb you're eating, but you cannot again bolus for the blood sugar you have already corrected, or that's when it becomes stacking. Now there are times, especially early on, when your doctor really might not want you to eat in between or only have 15 carbs when they're trying to figure out dosing, things like that. So once again, this is an ask your endo type question. But back to the article, are you bolusing with your emotions? A lot of people, and I'm here too, will say, I can't stand that high blood sugar. We've got to get it down. And I'll tell Benny, bolus again, let's do it. And some people have called that rage bolusing, especially when they're really high, if they're sick or they've missed something. He missed a lunch bolus the other day and he knew it, but it was just too late. And then he was 300 for a while and you're like, oh, I can't wait. I definitely get a little emotional. So what to do about it? Well, this article talks about you cannot feel responsible for numbers you've treated that aren't moving. They say that there is some unrealistic expectations sometimes that insulin is slow. And especially if you've got a continuous glucose monitor that shows every reading, every 5 minutes it's showing you something. It can be, the technology gets ahead of the insulin. In other words, it can be very difficult to watch those numbers not come down as fast as you'd like. And they talk about, don't blame yourself, be patient, understand how it works. And if you are really finding yourself doing this quite often and getting very emotional about seeing highs, it may be time to talk with your healthcare provider, your endocrinologist, your CDE, even a therapist. It can be something that maybe you can help by talking through. It also may be helped by switching insulin or changing up routines, or maybe your correction factor is really off. So it's worth it to find out more about why you're bolusing the way you are, why you feel bad if you do about how it's going, and whether some simple pump settings or correction factors can help. And if they can't, maybe it's time to talk to somebody, on the therapy side of this, because there's so much mental health, right? When it comes to this stuff, it's so rare in diabetes that you ever get positive feedback. Even if you get a great blood sugar number, and you're like, oh, I've been in range all day today. I think in the back of our minds, we're always thinking, well, who knows what's going to happen tomorrow? Or, that was one good day and we'll see what happens. So the feedback can be negative quite often, but there's a lot of help out there if you need it. All right. So this article was great. I will definitely link it up. I am really glad to see an article talking about the emotional side of why we do what we do when it comes to treating, when it comes to management and that sort of thing. It is so important. You cannot separate the mental side of diabetes from the physical side. It just cannot be done, in my opinion. And now you know better. Busy couple of weeks coming up. We just had our local JDRF walk in the North Charlotte area. I emceed that, which is always a lot of fun. Put some stuff on social media if you want to go back and look at that. Tomorrow, as you're listening, this is being released on April 17th. So on April 18th, I am doing a very early morning appearance in Charlotte television on the Fox station here about the Charlotte, the main Charlotte JDRF walk with an old friend of mine, Wilson, who works in Charlotte TV. We've worked together before. Man, I've been around this town for a long time. Yes, I'm getting up at the crack of dark to go down and do a live shot with him. I'm going to try to do some Facebook Live stuff. So if you're listening to this episode, a week later or a month later or a day later, you should be able to go to Diabetes Connections on Facebook and check that out as well. Later this month, I'm going to Touched by Type 1, a women's conference in Orlando. I'm excited about that. I'm doing my She Just Doesn't Get It presentation that I love doing with teenagers and their moms. We get to talk about each other behind each other's backs. It's always a lot of fun. And then first week of May, I'm going to Boston to the Lilly conference that was canceled. I hope it stops snowing in Boston by May. This is to see some of their new technology and talk about Lilly entering the device market. I'm excited to see what they're doing. Later in May, we have the JDRF 1 Challenge. It's a riding on insulin event here in the Charlotte area. And then later this summer, I'm going to mention this now, but you'll be hearing a lot between now and July. Of course, it's Children with Diabetes Friends for Life, the largest family diabetes conference, I believe, in the world. And I'm doing something fun there this year on Wednesday, the 11th. I will be doing a game show version of Diabetes Connections. And it'll be a live event there. We'll be taping it. But I'm going to find ways to get you involved as you listen, even if you're not attending Friends for Life, chance to win prizes and be in the game show. So watch out for that. Join the Diabetes Connections group. That's the best way to make sure you never miss anything, the way the lovely Facebook algorithms work these days. The group or the newsletter is really the way to go. So you can get to the group on Facebook, Diabetes Connections, the group. Or sign up for the newsletter. Just go to the website. It'll pop up. If not, I will put that out on Facebook page regularly. Whew. Thank you to John Buchanan, my editor at Audio Editing Solutions. And thank you for listening. It is a thrill to do this show every week for you. Such an honor. And I mean that sincerely. I love it. Thank you so much for the feedback. I'm getting such great emails and show suggestions. I'd love to hear from you. Stacey at diabetes-connections.com. All right. Did I miss anything? I think we're good. All right. I'm Stacey Sims. I'll see you back here next week.
Diabetes Connections is a production of Stacey Sims Media. All rights reserved, all wrongs avenged.